Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I'm Commodore Mike Noonan and I'm the Director General of Operations at Headquarters Joint Operations Command. And it's my pleasure this morning to chair this session on naval and interagency cooperation. The importance of strong relationships have been a common theme during the last 2 days, and there's abundant evidence of the strong joint and combined military relationships that we all enjoy around the room here with us today. The Chief of Navy made the point yesterday that SLOC security is an interagency responsibility, and this can be readily expanded upon to include that national security is an interagency responsibility. Of the 12 domestic and international operations that the ADF is currently committed to, all are either supported by or led by one, and in often several cases, many government agencies. Understanding these government agencies is just as important as understanding the different arms of the Defence Force. Our two speakers this morning are Dr. Sam Bateman, the Visiting Professional Fellow at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, and any of us that have had any involvement in the study of maritime policy, Australia's oceans policy, or maritime resource security during the last 20 years would know Sam well and would have certainly benefited from his extensive experience and knowledge. Today he will talk to us about the importance of the international law of the sea to Australia. Our second speaker this morning is His Excellency Major General Martyn Dunne, the current New Zealand High Commissioner to Australia. General Dunne has had a very distinguished career spanning the New Zealand Defence Force, the New Zealand Customs Service, and of course now the New Zealand Foreign Service. There would be few better credentialed to speak to us today about interagency cooperation and its vital importance to our individual and collective successes. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Sam Bateman, to the microphone.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. Distinguished visitors, ladies and gentlemen. Before I get into my paper, I should just mention that this paper has a co-author, Captain George Galdarisi, formerly United States Navy. George is in the audience somewhere over here, I think, yes. And when it comes to the Q&A session, I might direct some of the questions towards George. But our paper investigates how Australia might contribute to maintaining the rule of law at sea and using the law of the sea as a tool to promote Australia as a maritime power. This is in the context of two main factors. Firstly, Australia has one of the largest areas of maritime jurisdiction in the world. And secondly, the maritime environment around Australia, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, that maritime environment is becoming both more complex and more contentious. The paper is going to look at, this is the objective of the paper, but we're going to look at several main issues. I think, firstly, it's necessary to trace a little bit of the evolution of the law of the sea over the last few centuries, because we've got to know where we're coming from in terms of appreciating some of the differences in interpretation of the law of the sea that exist in our region at present. Then we'll look briefly at the geostrategic environment, highlighting in particular the contentious, some of these contentious law of the sea issues. Then I'll talk about key maritime legal regimes, then Australia as a maritime power, and then in the last part of the paper we'll look more specifically at what Australia and the Navy might do in terms of promoting Australia as a maritime power through these various legal regimes. Now, with the evolution of the law of the sea, I mean, for nearly 350 years, from the times of Grotius and Selden in the early 17th century until the 1950s and 1960s, the international law of the sea was largely static. It was dictated by the Western maritime powers, the imperialist powers of the world. The freedom of the sea was the dominant paradigm, with only a narrow belt of territorial sea under the jurisdiction of a coastal state. All that started changing, however, with the greater number of independent countries following World War II in the 1950s and 1960s. And the influence of these states, these newly independent states, of course, is evident in the main convention for the law of the sea, the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or I'll refer to it as UNCLOS. And we see the influence of these newly independent states in the introduction of new regimes in UNCLOS, particularly the regime of the exclusive economic zone, the regime of the archipelagic state, and acceptance of the principle of the maximum width of the territorial sea of 12 nautical miles. Now, those three developments were, in fact, opposed by the major maritime powers during negotiation of the convention, but the overwhelming influence of the newly independent countries led to their acceptance in UNCLOS. Now, central to our consideration today is that the developments, or the pace of developments in ocean law, has not slowed down over the last 30 or 40 years since 1982. What we've seen in this period has been increased concern for the health of the world's oceans and a proliferation of international treaties dealing with ocean usage. The dominant paradigms during this period, rather than the freedom of the seas, which is, of course, the previous paradigm, the dominant paradigms during this period have been increased coastal state control over adjacent waters and new limitations on the freedoms of the high seas, especially with regard to the freedoms of fishing. Now, these trends with the evolution of the law of the sea have coincided with the shift of economic and maritime power from the west to the east. And now, of course, it's conventional wisdom to talk about the 21st century as the Asia-Pacific century. Now, there are important implications here for the international law of the sea and how it might evolve in the future. Where differences are evident at present between Western, or primarily American, views of the law of the sea and those of the rising powers of Asia, there can be no certainty that the Western views will continue to prevail. Unfortunately, it's a characteristic of UNCLOS that it has many grey areas and built-in ambiguities that allow these opposing views to sit side by side. This is particularly the case with regard to military operations in the exclusive economic zone. Largely as a consequence of the maritime geography of the region, I'm really talking here about the Indo-Pacific region, with its large exclusive economic zones. When you visualise a map of the Western Pacific, virtually the entire Western Pacific, including obviously the seas of East Asia, are enclosed off as exclusive economic zone of one country or another. Numerous islands and archipelagos, overlapping claims to maritime jurisdiction, and many strategically important choke points all highlight the significance of the law of the sea in the region. I firmly believe that you can't understand regional maritime security issues without having a good understanding of the law of the sea and where countries are coming from with their particular differing interpretations. Examples of the contentious issues with the contemporary law of the sea are all evident in our region. Not so much in Europe, not so much in the Atlantic Ocean anymore. The contentious issues with the law of the sea are all now largely and primarily focused in the seas of East Asia. A key causal factor here is the long-standing tension between maritime powers seeking maximum freedoms of the sea and coastal states seeking to restrict these freedoms in their adjacent waters. And importantly, this coastal state view is the dominant paradigm in the region at present. An important trend in the Indo-Pacific region is the movement by coastal states towards increased regulation of their coastal states. And I think it's a major consideration for this paper that these trends towards increased coastal state control, and particularly particularly the growing territorialisation of the EEZ, are evident here in our region. Now, as we know, Australia over the years has been a strong supporter of the freedoms of navigation. But over the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen some initiatives by Australia which really do put us much more into the coastal state position with regards to increased coastal state regulation. Compulsory pilotage in the Torres Strait is, of course, a fine example of this. When Australia introduced this regime 5 or 6 years ago, it was strongly opposed by the United States and Singapore and some other countries at the IMO, but nevertheless Australia went ahead and introduced compulsory pilotage, which of course these opposing views would see as in conflict with the Straits Transit Passage regime in UNCLOS. We now have introduced exclusion zones around our undersea cables in the EEZ, the undersea cables that run out from Sydney and from Perth. Australia has declared exclusion zones around those cables. We now have a system of mandatory ship reporting in the Great Barrier Reef, which of course includes areas of exclusive economic zone, which some other countries of course would see again potentially as an interference with the freedom of navigation in an exclusive economic zone. And lastly, in Australian Annual Notice to Mariners, I think it's number 19, we declare the entire exclusive economic zone as a submarine exercise area. So you see, we have these examples where Australia, perhaps unintentionally and certainly paradoxically, we've been falling more in with this coastal state view of the law of the sea. Now, just a few comments about some key regions in the Indo-Pacific, key parts of the Indo-Pacific region and the law of the sea issues that are evident here. The Indo-Pacific region contains a long littoral stretching from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to the South and East China Seas. Within this region, Australia has the largest area of maritime jurisdiction with an EEZ of 8.51 million square kilometres, followed by Indonesia, an EEZ of 6.16 million square kilometres, India 2.3 million, Philippines and China. This long littoral is literally awash with dilemmas for maritime security, the provision of good order at sea and the management of regional seas. And that, of course, again highlights the fundamental importance of the maritime law, ocean law in our part of the world. From east to west, major issues relate to the Straits of Hormuz, Horn of Africa, Bay of Bengal, the Malacca and Singapore Straits and the South China Sea. And of course, other important issues for Australia relate to the Pacific Islands, countries and the Southern Ocean. Now, other speakers have spoken about the Straits of Hormuz, but recent threats to close that strait have focused international attention once again on the importance of the waterway. As we've already heard this morning, piracy remains a major problem off the Horn of Africa in the Arabian Sea. The Bay of Bengal perhaps is rather lesser known as a contentious maritime area, with disputes there over offshore oil and gas and conflicting claims by littoral countries to extended continental shelves. Countries around the Bay of Bengal have all made submissions, overlapping submissions relating to claiming the continental shelf within the Bay of Bengal. Hopeful sign is that Bangladesh and Myanmar have taken their maritime boundary claims to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and India and Bangladesh have agreed to take their dispute to independent arbitration. With regard to the Straits of Malacca and Singapore, obviously again a very important shipping route and subject to the UNCLOS Straits Transit Passage regime. Now, a few years ago, there was a so-called cooperative mechanism for the Straits of Malacca and Singapore was agreed to implement Article 43 of UNCLOS, which requires consultation between littoral states around a strait used for international navigation and the user states, and who should pay for maintenance of arrangements for safety, environmental protection, and so on. That cooperative mechanism includes three elements: a cooperation forum where user states and littoral states, the users of the straits, meet with the bordering countries. an aids to navigation fund, and specific projects that might be agreed with regard to navigational safety and environmental protection in the Straits. Now, there was a tendency to believe that now we've got this cooperative mechanism, all the problems of the Malacca and Singapore Straits are going to go away. Unfortunately, that's not so, mainly because the Aids to Navigation Fund, which was clearly the fund which is going to bring in money to pay for these various arrangements, aids, etc., the required contributions have not been forthcoming. Ship owners and ship owning associations have not supported the fund, as they regard it as an interference with the freedoms of navigation through a strait used for international navigation. Now, this situation, I would anticipate, is going to lead Indonesia and Malaysia to consider once again stricter measures over shipping passing through the Malacca Straits, perhaps even some form of compulsory pilotage following Australia in the Torres Strait, or trying to fiddle with the law of the sea to introduce some arrangement, some scheme of non-suspendable innocent passage applying certainly to the Malacca Straits. So that's a possible development. With the South China Sea, the situation appears to have deteriorated in the last year or two, with the tensions increasing. And at heart of this, of course, the US has emerged as the new key player in the South China Sea, and at the heart of and of course, there's been these tensions emerging between China and the US. And at the heart of those tensions are different interpretations of the rights and duties of states in an exclusive economic zone. China believes that certain actions by the United States, particularly the activities of American military survey vessels, are conducted without due regard for the rights of the coastal state, while the US asserts that these are parts of the freedoms of navigation in an EEZ. The South Pacific is an area of increasing importance to the international community and especially to Australia. Our principal contribution over the years, of course, has been through the Pacific Patrol Boat Program. But progress with addressing what will be Australia's future contribution to maritime security in the South Pacific has been slow, and there are perceptions that Australia has dropped the ball with regard to regional maritime security assistance. Lastly, the Southern Ocean, and of course we're aware of the potential tensions and risks of clashes at sea between the Japanese whaling fleet and protest vessels. Now, coming on to our maritime legal regimes. A fundamental challenge with the provision of good order at sea in the Indo-Pacific region is that most regional countries have very different perspectives of key law of the sea issues, particularly the ability of a warship to transit the territorial sea without providing prior notification to the coastal state, and rights and duties in the exclusive economic zone. Most recently, in May last year, Thailand finally ratified UNCLOS, but in doing so they made a statement that it was their understanding, Thailand's understanding, that the Convention excludes any non-peaceful use of the EEZ without the consent of the coastal state, in particular military exercises or other activities which may affect the rights or interests of the coastal state. That declaration, of course, was very similar to China's position on military activities in the EEZ and was made by Thailand despite some hard pressure from the United States not to make such a declaration. Indeed, it's a major limitation of UNCLOS that the United States remains outside the Convention. The main problem with the US that had initially with ratifying UNCLOS was the attitude of the powerful American mining lobby to Part 11 of UNCLOS dealing with deep seabed mining. However, to some extent, and reading articles on the topic, US concerns may have shifted to the security environment, with perceptions that the ratification of UNCLOS could inhibit maritime operations by forces of the US. UNCLOS was formulated in a period when there was less concern for the health of the marine environment than there is at present. Norms and principles for the preservation and protection of the marine environment have multiplied exponentially over the last 20 years. And it's not surprising that many gaps in UNCLOS relate to environmental protection of the seas. Navigational regimes in UNCLOS are an example of this. The regimes of Straits Transit Passage and archipelagic sea lanes passage apply according to the Convention to all ships and aircraft. And there's no direct right of a coastal or archipelagic state to prevent the passage of a vessel that is deemed to be potentially threatening to the marine environment. And of course, Australia's introduction of compulsory pilotage through the Torres Strait is an example of that. The second limitation with our maritime legal regimes is many key regimes, and I mentioned particularly here the International Search and Rescue Convention and the Sewer Convention, the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of navigation, are actually not well supported in our region. There are relatively few countries that have actually ratified these key conventions. Moving on to Australia as a maritime power. Now, this map, of course, is familiar to Australians in the audience, but foreign overseas visitors may be less familiar with the extent of Australia's jurisdiction. Green areas, of course, are the EEZ around the continental landmass and the various offshore islands, and the purple areas are areas of extended continental shelf, which, of course, have now been accepted by the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Now, this claim or jurisdiction, maritime jurisdiction, and if we put the Australian Antarctic Territory into consideration, means that Australia has the largest claim to jurisdiction over some part of the Earth's surface than any other country in the world. And that surely means that Australia is an oceanic and environmental superpower. This table in the paper actually sort of highlights the figures. You can see that the EEZ around the continent and the territories, Australian Antarctic Territory, comes to 10.19, nearly 10.2 million square kilometres. Add in the continental shelf another 3.5 million square kilometres to a total claim to jurisdiction over the Earth's surface of just over 27 million square kilometres. And of course, over half of that, as you can see, is over ocean or sea. The Australian Antarctic Territory is nearly 1/2 of our claimed land territory, but even without that area, Australia would still rank second after Russia in terms of areas of Earth's surface under some form of national jurisdiction. Russia claims 21.5 million square kilometres of Earth's surface, the United States 20 million square kilometres. Now, clearly, I believe this gives clear responsibility or a clear indication of Australia's responsibility to take a leadership role with promoting good order at sea in our region. But there are many problems, as I mentioned already, with the rule of law in many parts of the Indo-Pacific region. This, by the way, of course, is Australia's search and rescue region. And that again constitutes, I believe, roughly 1/9 of the Earth's surface. When we talk about, before I talk about what Australia and the RAN might do, I'd just like to briefly talk about some regional ocean issues. There's a rich potential for marine resources in the Indo-Pacific region, but the development of those resources is troubled by major jurisdictional problems. There are relatively few maritime boundaries in the region, and most regional countries tend to be looking for fences in the sea to say that when we look out to sea, there's a fence out there, we own out to there, we're going to manage that ourselves, and you have what's on the other side of the fence. And of course, that's not how you can think about ocean space. We've got to think more cooperatively about ocean space, but at this stage, unfortunately, when we look across the region, the tendency is to think in terms of national jurisdiction and managing ocean space in terms of national sovereignty. What we need to see in the region is a much more cooperative mindset towards managing the oceans and seas of the region, and this, of course, where Australia, coming back to our key interests, has potentially a leading role to play. And we'll just talk about some of the things that Australia and the Navy might do in this regard. US-China relations. Among all the countries in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia has one of the largest stakes in hedging its bets between the United States and China. Tensions between these major players, particularly in the maritime domain, threaten regional stability and constitute a major obstacle to good order at sea in the Indo-Pacific region. Australia is challenged to keep its American and Chinese balls in the air without either bouncing. There is, of course, the reality of geography. China is locked into the region, but the staying power of the United States, despite what we've been hearing in terms of policies from Washington in the last 6 months or so, may be open to question. There are grounds to believe, particularly with the budgetary situation in the United States, that Washington may be overly ambitious in terms of what it can deliver in the Asia-Pacific region. Implications for Australia, of course, in the worst-case scenario, Australia, we can't up anchor, sail ourselves across the Pacific Ocean and anchor off the coast of California under the umbrella of the United States. And I think we've got to be realistic with regard to that. Given the duality of Australia's strategic and economic interests, we could play a key role in helping to bridge the gap between the United States and China. Perhaps here we could help bridge the gap in particular that exists between the United States and regional countries on law of the sea issues. For example, the US Commander's Handbook on the Law of Naval Operations includes EEZs within the scope of international waters, where as far as regional countries are concerned, clearly they are not. Exclusive economic zones are sui generis in the UNCLOS, subject to their own particular legal regime, and an area where coastal states have important rights and duties. That US Commander's Handbook contains no reference to the fact that the freedoms of navigation and overflight in an EEZ should be exercised with due regard to the rights and duties of the coastal state. Further guidance to US commanders on that issue might help the regional situation, including the provision of examples of activities, including examples of naval operations that would not have due regard to the rights and duties of the coastal state. With regional relations, Australia has extensive common interests with our big maritime neighbours, and I'm thinking here particularly of India and Indonesia. All three countries have a mutual interest in enhancing maritime security cooperation in the Indian Ocean region, where the three countries have key strategic interests. Trilateral dialogue with India and Indonesia on ocean-related issues would be especially beneficial. With the South Pacific and the end of the Pacific Patrol Boat Program looming on the horizon, there are opportunities for the REN to play a key role, or continue to play a key role in helping to build a maritime surveillance and enforcement regime in the South Pacific. Moving on to capacity building, I think this is an important area where Australia could be contributing more. Many islands and coastal states in the Indo-Pacific region have large exclusive economic zones, including our closest neighbours. But these countries lack the capacity to manage their areas of maritime jurisdiction effectively, including activities like maritime surveillance and enforcement, search and rescue, marine scientific research, resource management, and so on. Australia could be doing more, I believe, to assist regional countries with developing the necessary capacity. However, in July last year, the Australian government, released a new international aid policy called an Effective Aid Program for Australia, making a real difference, delivering real results. And that statement declared that the fundamental purpose of Australian aid is to help people in developing countries overcome poverty, and that this purpose also serves Australia's national interest by promoting stability and prosperity in its region and beyond. It identified 5 core strategic goals: saving lives, promoting opportunities for all, sustainable economic development, effective governance, and humanitarian and disaster relief. But despite the major maritime aspects of all 5 of those goals, the policy, believe it or not, made no specific reference to oceans and maritime issues. Although agriculture and rural issues are mentioned frequently throughout the statement, there is no reference at all to the important fishing interests of many regional countries. Australia is thus missing an important opportunity to contribute more effectively to the management of regional oceans and seas. And after our first session today, you could add a couple of other issues, of course, hydrographic assistance, and as the Deputy Hydrographer explains, we already do provide hydrographic assistance to our near neighbours. Perhaps, though, in a capacity building context, we could look beyond our immediate near neighbours. The other issue, Noel Hart referred to the problems with port-state control. In the Indian Ocean Memorandum of Understanding relating to port-state control is clearly ineffective. It is not working. There are large numbers of unsafe ships operating in the Western Indian Ocean, because most South Asian countries and Eastern African countries are not proper parties or not fulfilling their obligations under that MOU. The main reason why they're not fulfilling their obligation, of course, is lack of capacity. Again, it's an area where Australia could be providing assistance. So, in conclusion, Australia, as I've pointed out, is at the centre of a great oceanic domain. Not only is it large in size, but it's also very dynamic in terms of the complexity and the contentious nature of the issues that exist in that domain. Australia should be playing a leading role in managing this oceans area. But in doing so, we have to basically recognise the importance of the ocean law, international law of the sea, and work towards a better understanding of the international law of the sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. Certainly, you've highlighted the complexities and challenges that we all face in our extensive maritime domain, and how the law of the sea affects us all. There's no doubt there's been a lot of change in the last 30 years since UNCLOS of '82, and I think we will continue to see that evolve over the coming years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to now welcome Major General Dunne to the microphone.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you very much, and I want to first by thanking the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Griggs, for the invitation to attend the Sea Power Conference and the opportunity to speak. As a retired Army officer and serving diplomat, I feel very privileged to be able to be here to address a Sea Power Conference, in particular on naval and maritime security issues. Now, although I left the New Zealand Army over 6 years ago, I continue to have links with both the New Zealand and the Australian defence communities. I'm currently still the Colonel Commandant for New Zealand SAS Regiment, and through regular contact with a number of ADF personnel and old mates, many of whom I've seen their faces today, postings in Australia, I can tell you it's very helpful to know the CDF, who was a classmate at Staff College, and on operations the Secretary when you need help in the diplomatic community to get a few answers to things. It's been very beneficial indeed. And in my current role, I've not had the opportunity to talk to a large group of ADF personnel. So today, on this occasion, I'd like to pay tribute to all the members of the ADF for the work that you've done in the region and across the globe in service to your country. Afghanistan, of course, which I've visited many times, and most recently last year, receives a high profile because of the nature of the mission. However, there are many others that are just as important, and none more so than Operation Resolute, which is, of course, the contribution to protect Australians' borders and offshore maritime interests. My association with Border Protection Command and the Australian Border Protection Service during my time as Controller and Chief Executive of the New Zealand Customs Service has especially highlighted the need to coordinate where we intersect very closely. And there's been reasonably recent opportunities for this from the threat brought about by asylum seekers in civs, suspected illegal entry vessels that might have been destined for New Zealand, where we required close coordination of intelligence and effort to run down the likelihood or otherwise of such an event. And in my most recent visit to BPC, in my new role here in Australia, reinforced the need to keep abreast of events and keep those contacts alive as we face the operational challenges that presents together. And we also serve in a number of other overseas operations with the ADF. But two I would like to just point out, of course, is CTF 150, which is a command group deployment in Bahrain, and of course the Royal New Zealand Navy sailors who are serving in HMS Melbourne and who are about to set sail very shortly abroad. From my perspective, the defence relationship between our two countries is in very good health. And despite a couple of sporting fixtures in between in the last quarter of 2011, namely the Rugby World Cup, which I was going to bring along today, but I'm sorry I wasn't able to, and the Hobart Cricket Test, of which, as an aside, I was on a formal visit to Tasmania at the start of the test and had to endure the first day, which looked like it was going to be an absolute disaster, only to leave that evening, which I then regretted because the next 2 days or 3 days certainly went our way. However, the overall relationship between our two countries is in good shape. And I just might dwell for a few seconds just on the weekend, this last weekend during the Tennis Open, which was a side event, of course, where the two Prime Ministers and 7 Cabinet Ministers from Australia and New Zealand met in Prime Minister to Prime Minister discussions and then a joint Cabinet meeting. Out of that meeting, with very good friendships that have developed, there were, of course, a change since our election and indeed a reshuffle in yours of Cabinet responsibilities. And I thought a couple of points that might be of interest to you, unless you've had access to the communique and some of the decisions that came out of it. The Defence Review that was commissioned early last year to look at complementarity and areas that could be beneficial to both of us was signed off and essentially agreed that we needed to work together more closely in the region and cooperate on capability development and procurement, which is, I think, a very interesting point looking ahead. And then the two Prime Ministers went further to look at issues of cooperation in the cyber space, and now New Zealand, who has been an observer on the National Counter-Terrorist Committee, and indeed the Emergency Management Committee, will now be full members of that. We already participate in the Ministerial Council meetings, but now we'll take full membership of those two areas. And of course, as we all, certainly the two countries, build towards the commemorations of 100 years of the First World War and of course Anzac and the Anzac tradition, none more so is that special to me as myself and my colleague, your Australian High Commissioner to New Zealand, are both ex officio members on that council. And of course, I couldn't go without mentioning the great support that Australia gave, certainly even from the Defence Force and others, of course, to Christchurch during our time of need, most recently in the earthquakes that struck Christchurch, and I'll come back to that later on. There are other areas, the maritime and airlift support we've given, and of course the recently signed therapeutics agreement, of which I will mention no more than the term, because some of the stuff that's in there, I tell you, defies logic around how that's going to come together, but it is, for those that are concerned, a very important area. But I'm not here to talk about Australia-New Zealand bilateral relations. I'm here to talk about a subject which in the past I've been very much engaged, and of which I still maintain a close interest, to share with you my views on how New Zealand deals with domestic and external security risks, and in particular, how we approach these risks from a whole-of-government, interagency, cooperative perspective. From my previous careers and prior to joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in May, when I was asked to be the High Commissioner to Australia, I was the head of the New Zealand Customs Service, as I mentioned, and Commander Joint Forces New Zealand before that. In both these roles, I work closely with other security sector agencies to counter or mitigate risks to the security of the people, the borders and natural resources and broader security interests of New Zealand. I'm also mindful of the previous speaker and his scholarly credentials, Dr. Sam Bateman, and I'd like to inform you up front that my treatment of the subject will be very much through the eyes of a practitioner's lens rather than an academic view. Seamanship is, however, where my experience is extremely limited currently to Lake Burley Griffin in a laser yacht, and I will not claim any expertise in that area, especially not as the following gentleman claimed. For those of you who don't know, that was the famous words of Captain E.J. Smith prior to becoming captain of the Titanic, or indeed Captain Francisco Schettino, so I will not enter into the realms of deep naval matters. During this presentation, I intend to briefly discuss the geopolitical situation that New Zealand finds itself in, contemporary threats and risks, the challenges we face, and how an often born cliche of working together in a whole-of-government approach to it has worked for New Zealand. From time to time, you'll have to excuse me as I head inland, or take the liberty of heading inland to provide an example or two to illustrate the point. As illustrated in this slide, somewhere, here we are, New Zealand is geographically remote, described often as the last bus stop on the planet. And our hemisphere is dominated by vast areas of water and a couple of large land masses to the west and to the south. New Zealand is considered by many to be small, however it just looks small because of all the water around it. And in comparison to Australia and Antarctica, New Zealand in terms of land area is about the size of the United Kingdom. And some wit recently told me that there is a school of thought, I think it's fairly small, that New Zealand is twice the size of India, except the problem is that 96% of it is underwater. Putting the size argument aside, New Zealand does have a small population, a relatively modest economy. New Zealand's population is currently 4.4 million, and of course would be 5.5 million if many of them return from Australia to New Zealand. And a GDP of about 130 billion. To provide some context, New Zealand population is equal to that of Sydney or the population of Queensland. And as far as GDP is concerned, New Zealand's world ranking is 63rd, whereas Australia is 18th. These comparatively modest numbers will be put in context when I come to dealing with the challenges we face. Through increasing levels of interconnectivity, 24/7 access to world financial institutions, globalisation has brought, as it has for most countries, New Zealand closer and closer to everybody else in a virtual sense. To that end, and in the digital age, we benefit to some extent by virtue of seeing the sun, the first country to see the sun. But the physical reality is that New Zealand remains geographically remote and highly dependent on trade routes in the air and on the oceans. Moreover, as greater than 95% by volume of New Zealand's trade is transported by ship, the security of international sea lanes of communication that link New Zealand to her markets is very important to us. Equally important is the protection of natural resources, including fish stocks, oil and gas and minerals that are found in the EEZ. Regardless of geography, since the time of the great canoes, New Zealanders have long travelled to the four corners of the world, highest mountains, across broadest oceans, and in so doing participated in world events, often punching way above our weight. Whether they are costly wars, international engagement, scientific invention, innovation, leading social policy initiatives, isolation is not and has never been in our national interest. Despite the importance of the sea to New Zealand's economy, most New Zealanders view the sea that surrounds the country as a bulwark against external threats and a place to conduct recreational activities. Unlike Australia, where you were confronted during World War II in both Darwin and Broome, and now almost daily reports of asylums seeking boat arrivals, New Zealand public are generally blissfully unaware of the risks that exist in the maritime environment until an event occurs, such as the grounding of the Rena in the Bay of Plenty in October last year. If the images of oil on the beach or containers on rocks did not excite the public, pictures of wildlife covered in oil certainly did. And this story displaced the Rugby World Cup, of course only for a matter of hours, from the front pages of the newspapers. In the terms of size, geography, resources and future opportunities, New Zealand's maritime environment is an important strategic asset that needs to be understood and protected in order that benefits can be realised now and in the future. Our maritime interests cover an immense area and include an EEZ and continental shelf extension, the Southern Ocean to the south of New Zealand and the Ross Dependency. And we also have constitutional obligations to the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau. This next slide shows the extent of the New Zealand Maritime Search and Rescue Zone. And of note, in the past 14 months, there have been at least 4 SAR incidents in the deep Southern Ocean and Ross Sea area, 2 Korean fishing vessels and a yacht and another ship. Like other maritime nations, the threats and risks to New Zealand faces include use of the sea by those who engage in illegal activities, such as piracy, transnational crime, unauthorised maritime arrivals, illegal exploitation of natural resources, illegal activities in protected areas, prohibited imports and exports, compromises, particularly in biosecurity, which for us would be a disaster if it was to occur, especially in the case of something like foot and mouth, marine pollution and maritime terrorism. All those things, of course, are of interest to us, but many of them have a lower priority than others. More generally, maritime interests closer to New Zealand include maintaining good order at sea, protecting our border, secure the sea lines of communication, manage our natural resources, and protect our offshore infrastructure, such as oil and gas installations and undersea communication links. Some risks are increasing, particularly those involving transnational organised crime, and I'll come back to this in a moment, and those linked to increasing world demand for food and other resources. In this latter issue, that poses the most immediate future threat as the poor state of fishing stocks in the Northern Hemisphere deteriorate, and they are now stealing our fish in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is evidenced by a growing number of foreign-flagged vessels fishing in the high seas around New Zealand and in the Te Whaka Moana countries, Tonga, Niue, Tokelau, Samoa and the Cook Islands. Reducing those fish stocks, of course, is not only detrimental to their economies, but the political stability of each of them. The increased number of foreign-flagged fishing vessels in our EEZ has resulted in a number of instances of illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing activity. We do patrol these by ear and have noticed a disturbing trend of vessels operating with all identifying features removed, as shown in this slide. IUU activity is also on the increase in the Southern Ocean, and in some cases the vessels operating in this area are using fishing methods that have been banned, and of course the bycatch of that often finishes up being seabirds. As noted above, marine pollution events always strike a chord with the general public. As this audience knows well, the risk of collision or grounding at sea is always present, especially when operating in congested waterways or in close proximity to navigational hazards. These risks are mitigated through good seamanship, well-charted shipping lanes, and the use of modern navigation systems. Notwithstanding the 5th of October last year, the container ship Rena ran aground on a well-charted reef off one of New Zealand's busiest ports. For months, contractors have worked tirelessly to remove fuel oil and offload containers. However, weather conditions this year in January didn't help. As you would have seen if you'd watched the media, and the Rena split in two and remains a major environmental hazard in New Zealand coastal waters. With respect, and just recently I saw in fact that tugs are towing the remains, or in fact it's worse than that now, but towing containers off the top of that ship. With respect to potential risks or threats to New Zealand, the issue at the forefront of senior security sector officials' minds at the moment is always around the mass arrival by sea of illegal immigrants that you are only too well aware of. And of course, the current situation here in Australia and the threat to New Zealand was really brought home to us with this mass arrival of the Sun Sea in Canada, just to show that how far you can go if you're determined to do so. While I acknowledge that the Australian policy in this area is in a state of flux, depending on the outcome of that policy debate, and in the face of the hazards that a long ocean transit would involve, the risk of New Zealand becoming a destination for asylum seekers is likely to increase. The New Zealand Customs Service is responsible for the operational execution of this, both the interception, boarding, escorting, and to the arrival place, where immigration officials take over. And that, of course, in New Zealand's case, is, while it's done by Customs, could not be done without the support of the Defence Force. Our plans are well tested and rehearsed, but like any plan, it relies on the competencies of all parties, and as you well know, no plan survives beyond HR. Until recently, we were concerned that Australian policy settings would indeed force the issue, but your current circumstances have allowed for further fine-tuning of New Zealand contingencies. And only one near miss has occurred, which was a couple of years ago, where the Australian-based New Zealand Customs officer managed, with the support of BPC, to turn that around. I mentioned earlier New Zealand has a small population base and comparatively modest economy. This, coupled with the current international economic environment and closer to home, the economic shock resulting from the Christchurch earthquakes, means that all government departments are taking budget cuts. New Zealand has always been resource constrained. However, the current economic situation has refocused attention on government spending, with a commitment to return to budget in 2014-15, 1 year behind yourselves. As a result, there's a concerted drive to bring efficiencies to public service. Working smarter is not just a bumper sticker in the New Zealand public service. We have to do it as a matter of financial survival. Put simply, we have to do things smarter, we have to do things better, we have to find ways of doing business differently. And the security sector is not immune from that. This slide here is some quotes from the Minister of Finance, where he talks about what we need to do as a country and indeed in the public service and across the spectrum that it's involved with. We've recently seen the Ministry of Fisheries again reabsorbed into the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. A lot of this makes sense because there's a lot of efficiencies and money that is wasted with a plethora of departments and in our case, a plethora of state-owned enterprises. And you're probably aware that New Zealand Defence Force is not immune from this, and an aggressive value for money reform program is underway to move resources from the back to the front. I was able to take part, or privileged to be asked to take part of a three-person independent panel, along with the former head of Foreign Affairs and a leading business identity in New Zealand, on the Defence Review 2010 White Paper. And while we went through, obviously, the capability side of it, threats and opportunities, there was another value for money review that was done. In addition to financial challenge, the wider security sector has to deal with a common perception that New Zealand is safe from external threats and the view that public money would be better spent in other areas such as education and health. Sound familiar? The Rena grounding has raised public awareness of the risk of major pollution event happening in our waters, and the yearly deployment of the Japanese whaling fleet to the Southern Ocean focuses public opinion on the perceived fragility of sustaining the whale population, yet there is a public blindness to the capability and rate of effort required to protect our borders and natural resources and maintain sovereignty over the vast expanse of ocean for which we're responsible. So with these challenges in mind, how do we do it? New Zealand meets these challenges by adopting what I think is a bit of a cliche, a whole-of-government approach. It's easy to say. And I'll start with, as an example, our National Maritime Coordination Centre. The National Maritime Coordination Centre is a little bit like a mini Border Protection Command. Following a number of reviews from the new government in 2000, we established the National Maritime Coordination Centre in 2003 with the aim of integrating and working together all the agencies to ensure that there was a comprehensive national strategy for managing maritime risk. It was set up as an integral part of the New Zealand Customs Service, but it was the other way around to you in that it was embedded in the Joint Headquarters. And I, as the commander at the time, could see that this was very important because there was a lot of certainly in the Defence Force, that they could do it better, and they didn't need anyone else to help them to do it. The problem with that was that it was perceived by civilian agencies, such as Customs, as being a victim of capture. And that has survived to this day, where the NMCC now went through a tortuous process of command and control, is now well and truly embedded in the Joint Headquarters, but is very much a part of the Customs Service and includes officers from other agencies, fisheries, police, and others as required to fill that space. Most of the assets that are used by the NMCC to coordinate the allocation to achieve effective and efficient outcomes for surveillance are provided by the Defence Force, with some additional resources available from Customs. The gestation, as I said, was not easy, but the benefits have been immense. It spawned opportunities for a multi-agency network, restricted network. Hitherto, we didn't have a very joined-up secure communications process, and we've still got some way to go with that. But we can now at least share information, talk to one another, and obviously plan for missions that need to be deployed. The benefit to this, of course, following on from the NMCC discussion, New Zealand's capability and capacity to conduct maritime patrol and response activities in our EEZ, the Southwest Pacific and the Southern Ocean, has been increased significantly by the new offshore patrol vessels that were purchased under the auspices of Project Protector. The IPVs have now been operating successfully in New Zealand coastal waters for over 2 years. They've done sterling work in support of many different agencies, ranging from counting marine life for the Department of Conservation, being used extensively by Customs for drug trafficking, interception of drug trafficking vessels or suspected ones. And in fact, they have also taken on board officers, as shown here, from the Customs Service and other agencies to integrate, obviously, the operations they're on, and of course to bring together aerial surveillance with those surface patrol vessels. Meanwhile, the OPVs have spent the past year conducting trials. They've around the EEZ, in the Southwest Pacific, and in the deep Southern Ocean and Ross Seas, as evidenced by this slide. I mentioned before the IPVs and OPVs were delivered as part of a Project Protector package. The project provides a good example of a whole-of-government approach, because in the early stages, people got together from other agencies and worked collaboratively to look at what they needed. Not all of the individual capability requirements were met, however. By being involved in the process, and the parties to trade-off discussions meant that other agencies understood why certain decisions were taken and had a good feel for what the project would ultimately deliver. The key to this, of course, was also in the NMCC, and as I'll explain, in the Integrated Targeting and Operations Centre and Customs, the coordination of maritime patrol assets, and anything else we do is a coordination of intelligence. Sharing of information between government agencies has been problematic in the past, but I'm now happy to say that that's gone and grown a considerable amount. Notwithstanding the constraints that were evident, the New Zealand Customs Service took the lead and established the Integrated Targeting and Operations Centre. It was co-located, the first one was opened in 2006 in Auckland, and this most recent one is a brand new facility in Auckland City itself, which has brought together Customs, agriculture, biosecurity people, immigration, Maritime New Zealand, police, and indeed the intelligence agencies that required. And for those of you who followed the arrest of a little story here about Mr. .com, a lot of the operation for that was done out of the ITOC. The ITOC, I think, even I say so myself, has given New Zealand a huge edge in coordinating resources in one place, state-of-the-art, being able to take in all sorts of feeds, both globally and locally, to actually execute what we need. For the Customs Service, Each passenger list, etc., is gone through on a 24/7 basis and provides us the ability to identify the risks and reduce the imposition of targeting and taking people aside. What I'd like to show you now is just an example of how this works. Here you'll see in this short video clip a bow of a vessel. You'll see a small rubber boat. Makes its way under the wharf. $10 that the Navy can pay if you can identify the wharf. What this is about actually is this ship came to New Zealand and on an agricultural inspection dive, our agricultural people who we'd said, yeah, you do this, but keep your eye out for anything that's suspicious, came up pretty well straight away and said, you need to go down and have a look on the bow thruster. Tied to the bow thruster was a large container, which turned out to be drugs. Very well-known ship that starts with T, was involved in this, nothing to do with the company. This was attached in the Panama Canal with the drugs destined for Australia. Now that little rubber boat that you saw going there were the perpetrators in Australia going to check. They were very, very annoyed when they came back up and found that it had disappeared because we'd let several go, we'd stopped some, and we brought this together in a major operation which eventually ended in the perpetrators being arrested in a massive operation in Sydney Harbour some months later, which goes to show that not only that local knowledge and the integration, whole of government agencies, etc. is important, so it is with your close friends and allies. Like the establishment of the ITOC, the concept of also working together at the borders, and politicians certainly gave us the message that we needed to do that. And this, many of you who will have used SmartGate at terminals, which was a project that was started by Australia. When I took over customs, I was told we were going to do something like this. We were going to sign up a contract to investigate how to do it at a great cost. Fortunately for me, on a visit to Australia to see Michael Carmody, in fact, he had taken over while I'd been in customs for some time. I found out that you'd spent about $70 million in investigating with a French company Morpho, the instigation of SmartGate. And the rest, of course, is history as we move to introduce SmartGate on both sides of the Tasman, which has been an outstanding success. And as it goes forward, we've actually got ahead of you at the moment for departures and arrivals in New Zealand, but as technology changes, this will become even easier, and if the sharing of data, especially criminal data, can be worked out in the foreseeable future as directed by the two Prime Ministers, then there is a potential for the movement of people between us to be even easier. Getting the ITOC up and running wasn't easy, as you can appreciate, like it wasn't with the NMCC, and all these things were interagencies. Rivalries have to be herded together and forgotten, but the benefits, of course, are very great. Over the past 18 months in New Zealand, there's been a number of events which have required a multi-agency approach and response. And in particular, I just draw your attention to Christchurch earthquakes, the Pike Mine River disaster, and of course the Rena grounding as just recent examples. To do that, to bring that together, I have no intention of going through this diagram, but essentially this diagram is the Officials Domestic External Security Committee of the Department of External, well not Department, the Domestic External Security Committee, which brings all this together. Very similar to your NSC, but for contingencies and agencies that come together in the Beehive in Wellington to talk through how we're going to go about it and then execute the requirements. And of course, this was none more so than in Christchurch during the earthquake. This was probably the biggest challenge we have had, certainly that I can remember, probably from the Wahine disaster, and the scale of this was and is immense. What we thought was going to be $13 billion in rebuild is probably going to be somewhere around $25 to $30 billion over 5 to 10 years. It is, in fact, the third biggest natural insurance claim for any natural disaster that is recorded. And once the ground stops shaking, of course, as you'll see here, they can start to rebuild. This is a a new mall that's made out of containers that recently opened just before Christmas in Christchurch. And included in the multi-agencies activities, I would also say that the Rugby World Cup and security is included there. So in conclusion, New Zealand is remote in a geographical sense. It faces many of the same maritime risks and threats that confront other less isolated maritime countries. Notwithstanding, there is a perception by the general public that New Zealand is safe from external threats. We've always been resource constrained, but we are currently experiencing challenges as a result of the global financial crisis and the financial burden of rebuilding Christchurch. What we have learnt that only through interagency coordination can the best result occur, especially when constrained by tight financial circumstances, whether it be on the sea or on land. The benefits are immense, the outcomes obvious and tangible, and in our case, we can move very quickly because of our systems. State sector reforms are driving government agencies to implement smarter ways of doing business, including greater cooperation between them, and make effective and efficient use of taxpayers' money. The security sector has a good track record of adopting the whole-of-government approaches and benefiting from working in multi-agency frameworks. But there's more that can be done to improve performance and achieve desired security outcomes. Thank you very much indeed for giving me the opportunity to speak to you.
General Dunne, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us into the challenges faced by New Zealand in your maritime domain, and in particular the successes you've been enjoying in terms of interagency cooperation. The similarities to which those we face here in Australia, I guess, underpin the strong relationship that our two countries enjoy, particularly our two navies. And I'd just like to highlight the long history of training, operating and learning together that our two navies enjoy. Most recently, this was exhibited in Operation Render Safe, where the combined efforts of the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal New Zealand Navy had a very successful combined operation in clearing unexploded ordnance from the Naval Harbour and surrounding district, and it was a tremendous success. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have just over 10 minutes where I'd like to invite you to direct questions to Dr. Bateman and General Dunne. We don't have the benefit of roving microphones at the moment, but there are 4 microphones in the aisleways there. If you would please use those so that we can capture your questions for the recordings. I invite questions from the floor, please.
Sam Tangredi from the U.S. I'd like to ask Commodore Bateman a little bit more specifics about his proposal on Australia's potential role in bringing the U.S. and China closer together in agreement concerning the law of the sea, specifically the military activities in EEZ. Dialogue is good. I think there's a lot of forums for dialogue. Are there more specific proposals as far as what Australia can do as far as bringing this together?
A lot of forums where dialogue's taking place at present, and personally I'm not aware. I assume there has been dialogue between China and the United States on some of these contentious issues, and while some of that has been on the public record, a lot has not been on the public record. I think it'd be useful if there has been such dialogue. It should be on the public record because other countries are interested and concerned. India and Japan, of course, which are often conceived as being close allies in the US in strategic terms, also have differences with the US on key law of the sea issues, including in particular this aspect of military operations in the EEZ. An understanding of the law of the sea issues is fundamentally important. I think the basic issue, and I mentioned this in my presentation, is that the freedoms of navigation in an EEZ are to be exercised with due regard to the rights and duties of the coastal state. And I think that's one particular issue where USN commanders would benefit from some existing guidance. This even, I understand, has been an issue between Australia and the United States, when a few years ago, for example, two transiting destroyers, USN destroyers across the north coast of Australia, actually ordered away and prevented overflight by one of our Coast Watch surveillance aircraft. Now clearly a coastal state has a right to conduct surveillance activities in its EEZ. Now it's those sort of activities that I think that, I mean, Australia, as I mentioned again in my presentation, paradoxically seems to be a little bit in the coastal state camp. And I think in that regard, we are in a position perhaps to help bridge the gaps of understanding that exist on these particular issues. I think when it also comes, of course, to the issue of the US not being a party to UNCLOS, I don't think, and, you know, this is an easy thing to say, and George Galarisi might add comments, I don't think the people in Washington, for example, fully understand how regional countries see construe the implications of the fact that the US is not a party to UNCLOS. And I'm sure that that was an issue, for example, in Thailand, making that particular statement, which appears to be very similar to the Chinese. Because the US, being not a party to the convention, is in no position to lecture regional countries with regard to their interpretation of UNCLOS. And it's on those issues which I think that, you know, instead of regarding it as an issue which can't be talked about, Australia could perhaps, you know, be a vehicle for trying to bridge those gaps, some of those gaps that exist at present. Thanks very much. George, do you want to add anything at all?
I think Sam covered it pretty well. I think from the U.S. perspective, and by the way, I mean, you can only cover so much in a half-an-hour brief. I think in our paper, one of the things we point out is that from the U.S. perspective, successive U.S. presidents, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, chiefs of naval operation have been all for and very vocal about supporting the U.S. accession to the Law of the Sea Convention. I think right now, as you're reading the open media, it's hung up in our legislature, and it just hasn't risen up to something of importance enough for our Senate to adjudicate and pass on. But most of us look at it as glass half full. And to kind of get back to Sam Tangretti's question, we think of ratification as not being denied, but just delayed. Been delayed an awful long time, but I mean, some of us are glass half full, hopeful it'll happen. So,
thanks, George. Was there another question up the side there?
Yes. A question for General Dunne. I'm Tim Corr from the Department of Defence. General Dunne, you've given a good overview of the maritime capability of New Zealand, particularly under Project Protector. I'm just wondering about the maintenance of war fighting skills in the New Zealand Navy and indeed the New Zealand Air Force, the latter, of course, having withdrawn their combat capabilities some years ago. Would you care to comment on the maintenance of those warfighting skills vis-à-vis the constabulary and other maritime applications? Thank you.
Well, I probably will just revert to my time on the defence review. It was something that really actually worried me and I was generally concerned about. But I would say that there's no intention to not go, as I understand it, not to go ahead with the upgrade of the Anzac frigates, so they'll be sustained, and of course the Sea Sprites, and there may be more of those available somewhere from a shed near you. The issue of the protector fleet, of course, there's no doubt about it, that they are not combatant vessels, which is, you know, an issue. They do have a role to play, and they are very able vessels as they work up. And I'm not going to try to sort of fill the New Zealand Chief of Navy's shoes in that area. From the Air Force point of view, another issue that is of concern also is the lethality that is now lacking from the RNZAF. with certainly a change in, I mean, the Navy looks, you have to say, when you look at, if you're just worrying about vessels, is in really good shape. And the Air Force, of course, is similarly in a good shape with the upgrade of the C-130s, which will be an interim measure till another aircraft is decided sometime in the future. In the case of P3s, I understand from last night that that's, although well behind schedule, is actually made great progress lately and is certainly flying. The NH90s, they are very close to getting into the air, and the Augusta 109, which is, depend who you talk to, a training or a utility helicopter is there. Now the issue that you're asking is this dimension of lethality. I'm not going to answer it here, but it's certainly something that is going around in people's minds. The previous government was of the view that this is what they wanted to put their money into, but it will have to be addressed at some stage in the future, and none more so in our operations in Afghanistan. As I said, I have taken a close interest in with my role as Colonel Commandant, which is all care and no responsibility, I might add. But the loss of 2 soldiers on operations there brings home to you that you have to have the enablers, as your minister was discussing only recently as the weekend, for your withdrawal from Afghanistan to ensure that those enablers can keep you on the ground. So all I'll say in that space is, well, watch this space, because the question will have to be asked about where it goes to. And that's a personal view, not an official view, but I know that's one that exercises people's minds.
Thank you, sir. We've got time for one more question down the front here.
Commodore Lars Fleischer from the Norwegian Navy. I listened with interest to the description of the large sea areas. So a question for Dr. Sam Bateman, please. In order to maintain good order at sea, that also clearly requires resources, people, competence, probably ships and aircraft. Do you find that your capability is sufficient? Do you think you have the right balance between the different enforcement agencies and the military? And if that is not the case, what do you think Australia should do in order to maintain jurisdiction, take care of the responsibilities which lie on the coastal state, and in order to conduct enforcement as necessary? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that's the sort of question which I could give a very long answer to, which I obviously don't have time to. And if I understand the question correctly, I think, yes, Australia, we do have this large area of maritime jurisdiction. I think, fortunately, in the last 2 or 3, 4 years, and clearly with the developments that the capital acquisition program, which is underway for the Navy at present, there is the increasing awareness, I think, in Australia of the need for the relevant capabilities. But having said that, I think there's still a lot of work still to be done, and including in some of the things that I was talking about in my paper. I think there's still, to some extent, Australians still have that beach culture. The word seems to be getting out about that large area of maritime jurisdiction, and of course there's the question mark against the sovereignty in the Antarctic, and at this stage, of course, whilst Australia has declared an exclusive economic zone around the Australian Antarctic Territory, we have chosen not to enforce it. And of course, a lot of the whaling activities the Japanese whaling fleet are conducting at present are actually in Australia's and New Zealand's claimed areas of jurisdiction. As I said, there's still a lot of work to be done in Australia. I'm still not convinced that we have, and coming back to General Dunne's presentation, I'm still not convinced that we have the appropriate interagency arrangements in place in terms of our effective maritime arrangements, including for maritime surveillance and enforcement. And I think a fine example of that was in my paper, where I alluded to Australia's current international aid policy. All right, the maritime side of things didn't get into that aid policy. But off the top of my head, I can't really think of what government agency in Australia, what government department in Australia might have been responsible for championing that particular consideration, trying to get through to the aid side of policy that there was a lot to be done in our region in terms of maritime capacity building. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in bringing this session to a close, I'd like you to join me in thanking Dr. Bateman and General Dunne. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, sir.